Okay, so the promised cleaning person hasn't come yet, so I'll jump to the next podcast. Uh, I have to keep squeezing these in as I find time because this takes enormous amount of time, and I use the 5 minute rule. Every time I get a few minutes, I try to add a podcast. So central shifts in capacity development. Capacity development for resilience is challenging, but not necessarily for a safer and more sustainable. Uh, Completely wrong reading. Capacity development for resilience is challenging but necessary for a safer and more sustainable world. We should, in other words, not shy away from it, but instead do exactly the opposite. Must rush into it or be carefully tread into it. We must work harder to get it to work better. To assist that endeavor, I suggest 14 central aspects to keep in mind and focus on more effective capacity development projects and programs. So projectizing may still be necessary to achieve the objectives towards a preferred state, but those cannot be ad hoc, short-term, microized, and so on. Although each of these aspects is important in its own right, many are also related to each other in such a way that one depends on the on and may even require another. This framework suggests that there are minimum levels for which minimum levels for each of the aspects under which the effectiveness of the entire capacity development initiative is completely undermined. So you have to be careful about the weakest link or the minimum level beyond which you have to go to make sure that the system, human environment system that is under consideration actually accomplishes capacity development for resilience. These minimum levels are illustrated by the inner circle in figure 9.8 coming up. For example, an external partner implementing mitigating activities against floods without participation of any internal partner, a group of partners not having the knowledge or skills required for implementing their intended activities, and so on. Then it matters little if the capacity development initiative scores well on other aspects. Given that all 14 aspects exceed these minimum levels, the framework also suggests that the capacity development initiative works better the larger the area that is filled in total in estimating the performance for all aspects and plotting these qualitative estimations we see here. Okay, so these are called the spider web charts. So you have different directions. So championship, so let's say we start here: ownership, partnership, relationship, friendship, bipartisanship, scholarship, craftsmanship, grantsmanship, penmanship, authorship, mentorship, stewardship, leadership, and championship. Leadership and championship are not necessarily the same, right? So 14 central aspects of capacity development for resilience. So you can see that these in a very schematic way, this can be very critical, but you also need these to be very strong. Ownership is also important, but not as much as these. Championship is important, but not as much as leadership. Championship is basically somebody who's very passionate and is trying to drum up support from all the partners, let's say. Okay, mentorship is important. Authorship and penmanship are very important. We'll see what that means. Scholarship and craftsmanship are very important in terms of knowledge, expertise, and skills, and so on. So you get the idea, right? So these central aspects of capacity development for resilience are presented in the following 7 subsections, but relationship and friendship are mainly about the quality of the link between partners. Bipartisanship is about their ability to overcome differences to find common goals. Scholarship, craftsmanship, grantsmanship, and penmanship are requisite skill sets. Authorship, mentorship, stewardship, leadership, and championship are about roles and responsibilities, while Ownership and partnership are more overarching aspects of roles, responsibilities, and relationships. I'm emphasizing ship because we said, the title is Central Ships in Capacity Development. So these are all the ships that we are talking about. Okay, so let's read a couple of more in this podcast and then jump to the next podcast after we spent about 10 minutes. That's about the right length of podcasts. Ownership and authorship. One of the cornerstones of capacity development is local ownership. This means that internal partners always have primary responsibility for their own capacity development, while external partners have supporting roles. There is a broad consensus that lack of a local ownership is a fundamental reason for the generally poor results of many capacity development initiatives over the years. But there is ironically enough of a lack of consensus on what ownership really means. So ownership is important, and unless you see it and feel attached to it or feel that this is going to benefit you or that you have agency in it, you don't feel the ownership. But what exactly does it mean is not that well defined, especially since such central concepts have kept on changing meaning over time. Oxford English Dictionary defines ownership as the act, state, or right of possessing something. Ownership, house, car, whatever, or the idea, intellectual property. So act, state, or right. Correspondingly, ownership is in this context referred to as the formation and possession of ideas, strategies, development processes, resources, and results. So when there is a project which includes multiple players or stakeholders, if someone takes ownership and says, I'm going to get it done because I really believe it, or that this is really important for me or my community, then you have ownership. Okay? In other words, local ownership is about internal partners driving their own capacity development and not waiting for external partners to come in and help them. Capacity development must thus come from inside the community, organization, society, or other human environment system in question, though it may be initiated with support of external actors and nurtured through participatory approaches, always consciously making sure that the support never undermines local ownership. It has also been noted that external partners can play an important role in giving legitimacy to nationally led initiatives and processes. However, it is here that the principle of alignment comes in, stating that external partners should base their support on internal partners' strategies, institutions, and procedures. This is not happening to any great extent in practice. Instead, external partners have often a fix-it or know better approach to capacity development that is not tailored to fit the needs of the internal partners. Internal partners here are people who are going to actually benefit or suffer from the consequence of development capacity, and external partners are those who are somehow contributing finance, expertise, and other resources, right? Thus, generally ignoring established strategies, institutions, and procedures and creating parallel structures. Ownership entails commitment to the particular capacity development project or program in question, as well as ability to translate this commitment into action. Shouldering ownership is thus voluntary and cannot be imposed by outsiders. Local ownership can, in other words, not be fostered by persuasion and salesmanship, but instead by external partners continuously adapting their support to meet the internal partners' needs. This is the overall challenge that must lunchtime. This is the overall challenge that much of what is described in the following six subsections revolves around. So we'll read a bit more. So I should emphasize here, people should think of it as their own and not coming from outside, imposed from outside, persuaded from outside, and so on, even though sometimes the initial seed for growing ownership may come from external persuasion, but that messenger of external persuasion has to be somebody who is credible, legitimate in the eyes of the owners or the people that have to take ownership, and the message has to be salient so that the people can be convinced that the person is offering honest broker advice. One of many challenges for local ownership is illustrated well by time-worn quote, "Beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword." Beneath the rule of men entirely great, the pen is mightier than the sword. So what you get systematized, you can come in with a sword and kill a few people and force a few people to do something at the sword's edge, but what gets systematized gets sustained then. Okay, holding the pen when designing a capacity development project or program confers extraordinary power over the process. Authorship grants a critical prerogative to interpret frequently ambiguous signals from the diverse actors, thus facilitating for authors to bias the design of the project or program toward her own preferences, knowingly or unknowingly. So implicit and explicit value systems and biases and creep into actions when multiple stakeholders are involved. Okay, so it is, in other words, rarely enough to include internal partners in the process, not even in the rare cases when internal partners are actually participating in what Oxenham and Chambers refer to as full or catalyzed participation, as long as external partners are exclusively holding the pen and communicating the donors and other actors. So you understand that the external partners have to be seen as supportive providers of support and guidance and expertise and finance and so on, and not imposing any of their ideas explicitly or implicitly, but they should always be available as guides when need arises internally, right? For local ownership to be more than rhetoric, it is thus vital to also aspire local authorship of capacity development proposals and reports, or at least shared authorship in which internal partners are fully engaged in all aspects of the process. Okay, so we'll come back and read about leadership and championship, two more ships which are also critical, and try to understand why one may be more important than the other, even though both are necessary, right? So necessary and sufficient are something so we have to always worry about. So I turned a little to avoid light in my eyes, because in the first podcast I didn't bother with it, but I'm not sure how people watch it with the video, or they just turn off the video and just listen to the podcast. Okay, either way, see you in the next podcast on leadership and championship.